thank you all for being here. Thanks for that introduction. Just to briefly introduce what we're here to talk about, Paul's book is The Boxing Kings. You can see it's got a lovely design, When American Heavyweights Ruled the Ring, and it's out by Roman and Littlefield. And what it is really is a kind of history of heavyweight boxing, and also the last century of American history is told through heavyweight boxing. And Paul's picked certain champs to focus on, and he'll get into that more. But what we hope to talk about today is both boxing and boxing history and all of the themes and issues and events that boxing intersects with. And it intersects with just about every American obsession, race, sex, violence, it's all there in boxing and around boxing. And just briefly the format, Paul's gonna make some introductory remarks now. I'll briefly speak after that, then he and I will talk a bit about the book, and then the last 30 minutes or so, we'll turn it over and take any questions any of you have, and we hope you have some questions. So without further ado, Paul Beston.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Fred and St. Francis, and thank you, Emily. I have to say, when I told my mother that I finally finished a book and it was about boxing, she had to kind of shield her disappointment. But then I told her I am speaking at a college about it. I mean, come on, give me some credit. So, anyway, so she's rallying a little bit. Just some introductory remarks on the book. One of the underlying themes of this book is really just how significant the heavyweight championship was in American popular culture, and with the heavyweight championship, the champions themselves, especially guys like these three on our cover and some others. And they were really, in many ways, beyond the sports world in many respects. They were often in the newspaper, they were often on the front page, and they were written up. They were written up by great American writers running right through the century. And some of them, include Nellie Bly, famous journalist from the 19th century, interviewed John L. Sullivan, Edgar Lee Masters, Theodore Dreiser, Jack London, H.L. Mencken, Damon Runyon, Richard Wright and James Baldwin, Norman Mailer, Gay Talese, George Plimpton, Joyce Carol Oates. It goes on and on. These guys were important figures, and they meant things to people beyond just the boxing ring, and that was kind of what I was trying to capture in the book, besides just the fights. There's a lot of fights. There's plenty of fights. As I told one friend, don't worry, there's a lot of people hitting each other here. It's not just about culture. So some of the things that were written about these guys are also very telling. So, for example, Eldridge Cleaver, this is one of the quotes I used in the beginning of the book. He wrote, "The boxing ring is the ultimate focus of masculinity in America, the two-fisted testing ground of manhood, and the heavyweight champion as a symbol is the real Mr. America." The essayist Gerald Early upped him a little bit more and said, "The heavyweight champion is the emperor of masculinity." Norman Mailer, who was always good with a phrase, said that being heavyweight champion was a little bit like being the big toe of God. But the quote that really resonated with me, I also have in the beginning of the book, is from Bud Schulberg, who wrote On the Waterfront, and he also wrote a boxing novel called The Harder They Fall, which was later made into a movie with Humphrey Bogart, which is Humphrey Bogart's last movie, I think. And he says this: "We have a theory about the heavyweight championship, that somehow each of the great figures to hold the title manages to sum up the spirit of his time. All the great ones are not merely the best fighters of their day, but demigods. It may all be accidental, but the main currents of their period either shape their personalities, or their personalities seem wondrously to reflect their times." And so that quote was in my head a lot as I wrote the books. As much attention as I paid to getting the details right and making sure I had the facts right and who beat whom and how it all went down, I was trying to keep in mind the social context of America and the political and cultural context that was going on at the same time. And that context came into play the boxing ring more often than you would think. And these guys are really some of America's first important athletes, and they've had a large impact on our popular culture in a lot of ways that people don't remember today. So the book covers 120 years. It starts in 1882 and it finishes in 2002. There's 34 total heavyweight champions. There's too many to get into here, but it's just a smaller subset of that, just 7 guys who have really transcended the ring and become figures that are remembered in our popular culture, even by people who don't pay attention to boxing or even sports. So 3 of them are up here on the cover, and then there's a few others. So I'm just going to outline those 7 guys and what made them noteworthy to people and why Americans remember them today, and then Jake and I can talk. So the first one, who's not on the cover, is this guy, John L. Sullivan, who's really the first effective heavyweight champion from 1882 to 1892. And he's really the guy who, he's like George Washington, he sort of like creates the office. He becomes a heavyweight champion in a way that made it a commercial institution. He makes it a sporting institution in America. He makes people care about it, which is particularly impressive because for his whole career, boxing was illegal, and it would remain illegal for quite a while after that. But it was, by the time he was done, people were writing about him in the New York Times, and famous people were going to his fights, and presidents were asking for telegraph updates to get updates on his fights, even though all this is technically illegal. So that's the kind of appeal he had. And the other appeal he had was with Irish Americans. He represented the Irish. They were the largest immigrant group at that time. He was a hero among the Irish of immense proportions. There are 2 quotes about him that kind of survive in the culture a little bit. One is what he supposedly said when he would go barreling into a bar room or a saloon, and this is a man who knew bar rooms and saloons very intimately. He said, "I can lick any SOB in the house," supposedly. The other was supposedly said about him, which was when people would run into him and meet him and shake his hand, they would then rush over to their friends and say, "Shake the hand that shook the hand of the great John L." And somehow that line has survived. When I told one of my older brothers that I was working on this book, and he said, "Who are you starting with, John L. Sullivan?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Is that the guy that shake the hand that shook the hand thing?" And I said, "Yep, that's it." So the second guy is Jack Johnson, and he was heavyweight champion from 1908 to 1915. He was the first black man to win the heavyweight championship. And in 1908, that was a very, very big deal because even by 1908, the heavyweight championship was being regarded as a kind of national property and synonymous with American power and also with American masculinity, American manhood. And for most people in America at that time, what that meant was white manhood, not black manhood. So the idea of a black fighter in the ring fighting white fighters and beating them down before huge crowds was seen as hugely threatening by the powers that be at the time. Jack London, great novelist, is writing at ringside. When Johnson wins the title, he writes a newspaper story saying the white race must take the title back from Johnson. So Johnson is really, his whole career becomes kind of a mirror held up to America on the state of race relations at the time, which was not a very pretty picture. And the racism that was brought against him would have happened to anybody, I think, but it was particularly sharp with him because he was such a defiant and brave individual. He lived the life exactly the way he wanted. He was very flamboyant, and his final sin in white America's eyes was to have relationships with white women, and this would be finally the instrument that kind of brought him down, but that's another story. The third guy is Jack Dempsey. And he was the heavyweight champion during most of the Roaring '20s. So he was a contemporary of Babe Ruth. So now we're getting closer to people who are more familiar to us. And he, along with Babe Ruth, really kind of created the modern commercialized sports world that we know today. And I think that's not really well understood because people still know Babe Ruth. But I think Dempsey is being forgotten probably because boxing is beginning to fade from our consciousness. But you could make a pretty good argument, and I would be glad to make it, that Dempsey actually deserves more credit than Babe Ruth for making sports into this thing that it became. He came along a little bit before Ruth, right after World War I had ended. He fights in this exciting, aggressive style, a little bit like Mike Tyson later. He becomes an incredible gate attraction. And so the moment he shows up, the last remaining laws against boxing just come tumbling down. The idea that you're going to have laws against boxing is no longer viable. We need this guy because he brings money wherever he goes. New York State, for example, the sport was still illegal when Dempsey came along. Within a year of his winning the title, it was legal for good. He inspired promoters to build huge arenas seating 100,000, 120,000 people. You can see these pictures on the internet, and these are really some of the great spectacles of the 1920s. So when his career ends at the end of the decade, most of the pieces of what we think of as modern sports, tons of media coverage, public fan obsession, huge crowds, and most of all, big money. Those are all in place after Jack Dempsey. The fourth guy is Joe Louis. And he was heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1949. That's the longest that anybody ever held the title. He's the second black man to win the heavyweight championship. It was 22 years between him and Jack Johnson. He's the exact opposite of Jack Johnson. He doesn't present himself in the way that Jack Johnson did. He's humble, he's quiet, he's very dignified. He doesn't gloat over white opponents the way Johnson had. He's very aware of the example of Johnson. He's going to avoid that. He doesn't consort with white women, at least not in public. And his career, though, what would happen is through the course of his long career, his personality, his public dignity, his greatness in the ring, his service in the military during World War II, and finally his showdown, his famous showdown with Adolf Hitler's famous favorite boxer, a guy named Max Schmeling. All these things together would make Joe Louis the first Black American athlete who was admired and even loved by whites. And by the end of his career, he's fighting white opponents, and there's white fans in the arenas rooting for Joe Louis. And that's not very remarkable today, but at the time, it's quite remarkable. And the idea that that would have been possible in the time of Jack Johnson would have been unthinkable. So the last thing with Joe Louis, too, is that he is the guy who paves the way for a guy who everyone knows today, and that's Jackie Robinson. I mean, we all talk about Jackie Robinson integrating the major leagues, and it's a very important moment. But Joe Louis came along 10 years before Jackie Robinson, and Jackie Robinson even said on the day that he took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, I don't know if this day would have ever come without Joe Louis. So in the book, I actually called Joe Louis the most consequential athlete in American history, so I'm willing to back that up. Number 5 is Rocky Marciano. He was champion in the early 1950s, the Eisenhower years, early Eisenhower years. He's best remembered today for a couple of things. One of them is a number, this sort of mythical number, 49 and 0. 49 wins and no losses. He never lost a fight. He's the only heavyweight champion who never lost a fight. And this number is kind of like those baseball numbers like Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak. It kind of comes up from time to time. It came up this summer when Floyd Mayweather came back and had this pay-per-view fight that some of us got drawn into against our better instincts. And Floyd Mayweather was 49-0, so he was trying to go 50-0, and so people were bringing up Rocky Marciano again. It's kind of apples and oranges because Floyd's not a heavyweight. But anyway, the other thing with Marciano, his significance, is that he was really a symbol of the American dream, American striving at that time. He is the son of Italian-American immigrants. So I was mentioning before how the Irish had been the largest immigrant group when Sullivan came along. The Italian wave came a little later in the early 20th century, so Marciano's parents came over here. They were very poor, worked very hard, and he had just great determination to make it in America, and sports was his way to do that. And he became an Italian-American hero, just like on the par with Joe DiMaggio. I don't think there was any other equal to him. And even today, you can see his picture in Italian restaurants. I have still seen it. The last two, 6 and 7, are people who need no introduction. One is, but I'll talk about them anyway. One is Muhammad Ali, formerly Cassius Clay, champion for portions of the 60s and the 1970s. And he would become really, the most celebrated American athlete of all time, with the possible exception of Babe Ruth and maybe Michael Jordan. But it's a short list. These guys this is a level of fame that very, very few people reach, and you saw that last summer when he died. His funeral, there was like a week-long coverage of his death. The funeral was like a head of state. It took 3 hours. There were multiple eulogists. There were people throwing roses in the street. It's just an incredible kind of fame. And of all the figures in this book, he was the guy who most threatened to kind of break out of my control and just become out of my grasp. So I kind of bargained with his spirit, and I said, look, I'll give you 2 chapters. Everybody else gets 1. You'll get 2. So now just easy. And I think he would be very pleased by that. He's the only guy who gets 2. It's very hard to summarize all of his significance here, but I'll just say very briefly. First, he brought a level of showmanship and self-promotion that sports had just never seen anything like this before, and it's permanently changed sports, for good and bad. There are different opinions on that. And the second thing is that he melded sports with political and social concerns in a way that embedded these things together in such a way that they've never been separated. And that's as relevant today as it could possibly be. We see that with the NFL protests, and Muhammad Ali's name is invoked regularly. So his legacy is a huge one. It's a complicated one, but it's very, very large. And the last guy is Mike Tyson, who was champion in the late 1980s. There he is post-tattoo. When he first came up, he didn't have the tattoo. He was champion in the late 80s, and his career went through the 90s. And originally he was kind of an icon of black urban inner city experience. He came from a nightmarish childhood, grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in very difficult circumstances. But then his rise to greatness in the ring, eventually he becomes a kind of sobering example of the nexus between sports and violence, which is very much in our headlines. He serves a conviction in the early 90s for rape. He then comes back and resumes his career. But ultimately, to me, I think he is really the epitome of the whole arc of his career is kind of the epitome of the modern celebrity, because of the rises and the falls, the extremes, the love and hate, the reversals of fortune. They really typify modern American fame. And even now, in retirement, he's managing to be kind of symbolic, because he has remade his life in a very considerable way, a very impressive way. And to me, really reminds me that the most overrated quotation from an American writer, I think, is F. Scott Fitzgerald when he says, "There are no second acts in American lives." It's never made much sense to me. You should ask Mike Tyson about that, because he's doing pretty well. So those are the seven guys that kind of frame the story. But as I said, all 34 are in here, and they run through the narrative. And I feel badly neglecting them all, so I'm just going to mention three more very quickly. They're very interesting characters. One is Gene Tunney from the late 1920s. This is a guy who actually gets into boxing for the purposes of living a life of culture. He just maps it all out. He says, if I can win the heavyweight championship and make $1 million and possibly marry into wealth, I can then spend the rest of my life reading Shakespeare and sitting on corporate boards. And he succeeds and does this. He's amazing. So, and he hangs out with Thornton Wilder and George Bernard Shaw. Second is Floyd Patterson, who was champion at different times in the 50s and 60s. James Baldwin called him the most unlikely boxer ever, because he had such psychological conflict and insecurity, and yet he was a great fighter. He was also very involved with the civil rights movement at that time. And lastly is George Foreman, who was a great champion young in the 1970s. Then he retires. He becomes a born-again Christian. He comes back into the ring, middle-aged, big belly, wins the title back miraculously. And then, just the last chapter, he lends his name to this grill, this grill, which becomes the Foreman Grill, which has been described by a writer as the most iconic American appliance since the Franklin stove. So that's the kind of guys that are in the book, and that's what made me want to talk about them, because the fights are great, but it's the characters. Ultimately, if the characters weren't interesting, I don't think we would pay attention. But the main thing is they really have had an intersection with American life for a long time. That's not the case anymore, but it was for over a century. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Jake. Thanks.
Yeah, so that's a hard act to follow, and I think Paul gives you a very good sense of what's so compelling about the book. And it's not just these outsized mythic characters that he's writing about, it's also the way he's writing about them, which is really engaging, and that's what I want to highlight here. So I'm just going to go over a few passages from the book that I think illustrate the themes and give you a sense of what's so compelling about these characters. And, the nickname for the heavyweight champ for a long time has been the baddest man on the planet. I might have that slightly wrong. The baddest man on the planet, something like that. And each of these guys in a different way is supposed to represent that, but they obviously represent a lot more as well. And these intersections of these characters with the most important trends and events in the past century come up again and again. And that, I think that's part of that quote about the heavyweight champs kind of embodying the spirit of their times. But there's something else about a heavyweight champ, which is that, you can be this outsized mythic hero, but the stakes are also so high, right? And the possibility of loss is so great, and there's no more immediate and more crushing loss than getting beaten into defeat in front of a large audience. So, it's not like baseball where there's this symbolic theater of winning and losing. In boxing, you're beaten into submission. So you don't need to kind of drum up the drama and the pathos. It's all there right on the surface. And then there's the ways in which boxers become these historical actors, and that's what I want to highlight here. So just to set the scene, this is 1938, and Hitler's favorite boxer, Max Schmeling, is facing off with the great American fighter Joe Louis. Never were two athletes more freighted with symbolism than Joe Louis and Max Schmeling in 1938. Outside Hitler, Schmeling seemed to be the man of the hour in Germany. His identification with the regime, whatever his private feelings might have been, grew even closer. He was regularly celebrated in the German press, including in the magazine of the SS and Der Angriff, Goebbels' Nazi party newspaper. He attended Nazi party rallies at Nuremberg and participated in public celebrations of the Führer's birthday. He encouraged Germans to vote Ja in the phony referendum that Hitler set up to ratify the Anschluss, the Nazi annexation of Austria, and was photographed doing so himself. He attended preview screenings of Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia documentary, along with other favored insiders. But it was Louis who bore a national burden that few would have imagined. By 1938, his stature in black culture had reached new dimensions, as reflected in black popular music. At least 43 songs about Louis have been documented or recovered, more tributes by far than any other athlete has ever inspired. The songs ranged widely across blues, jazz, and gospel, from performers as well known as Cab Calloway and Count Basie, as legendary as Memphis Minnie, and as forgotten as Lil Johnson. So that sets the scene for you a bit. And now, just to prove that there is some brawling in the book as well, and that it's very well told. Donovan is the ref or the ump in the match between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling in their second fight after Schmeling controversially wins the first. Donovan wiped Schmeling's gloves off and made way for Louis again. The champion landed a right and a left hook to Schmeling's body, and then, stepping away slightly to give himself room, he placed a crushing right to Schmeling's downturned jaw. Schmeling crumbled to the canvas and Louis retreated again, almost skipping to avoid getting tangled in Schmeling's feet. As Louis leaped away, a white towel floated into the ring from Schmeling's corner, signifying surrender. Donovan tossed it away. American rules stipulated that only a referee could stop the fight, and it landed on the top rope where it hung like a ghostly talisman. Donovan moved to start counting over Schmeling, but Schmeling's men had had enough of the rules. They rushed into the ring to save him. Louis had won in 2 minutes and 4 seconds of the first round, just as he had promised Jimmy Cannon. So, one more brief passage, and that's because if you're in Brooklyn to talk about boxing, you better say something about Mike Tyson. So, as Paul mentioned, Tyson grew up not too far from here in Brownsville. And Tyson fought in a style that he learned from his trainer, Customato, that was called the Peekaboo Style. That was actually had a lot in common, as Paul mentioned, with Jack Dempsey. He was the first great champion. And Tyson, who was a real boxing historian, was very conscious of emulating Dempsey. And that was, if you've ever seen Tyson fight, he'd get down low like this, and then he'd leap up with that left hook. That's a poor imitation. That's not technical advice. I'm just dramatizing it. But the thing with Tyson was he was just incredibly explosive. And because he fought low, it made him look even smaller compared to some of these heavyweights. And then when he would, kind of explode like a leopard, it was all the more impressive. So this is a bit about Tyson. It's easy to look at the photo of the young boy knowing whom he would grow up to become, and say that he has a haunted face. It's a good face with the sweetness of youth and eyes that suggest kindness, or at least the capacity to be kind, but already what he knew of life was contest. Inside the walls of his home, out in the streets of Brooklyn, on school playgrounds. He never met the man listed on his birth certificate as his father. The man he knew as his father was a pimp who surfaced occasionally. His mother worked as a prison matron at the Women's House of Detention in Manhattan. When she lost her job and the family moved from Brooklyn's Bed-Stuy neighborhood to Brownsville, the picture darkened. Bed-Stuy was gritty. Brownsville was a shooting gallery. His mother went on welfare and never worked again. She and her friends sat in the apartment at night, drinking, smoking, and playing cards. Some waited for calls from Johns. Lorna Mae Tyson's son saw every kind of violent altercation, including ones resolved through the strategic use of boiling water. And I thought that was a particularly haunting passage, but I bring it up also because when you see what Tyson became, not only as a great champion and later as a criminal, and then in the last arc of his life as a kind of reborn family man, it's pretty incredible. And if you listen to Tyson, he's such a outsized character, it can be hard to pick up on sometimes, but he's actually a very reflective and interesting guy, and it comes through in some of the interviews, and there might be no one more truly self-made, in a sense, than Tyson, for good and for bad. So that's what I've got for now, and I think we'll just talk a little bit more about the heavyweights and what all this means, and then we'll open it up to take some questions. So, Paul, the first question I wanted to ask you was, why heavyweights? Why not the story of boxing or the story of middleweight boxing? Why heavyweight boxing?
Well, one answer is the story of all the boxing is too big, and I'm not going to live long enough. But yeah, the heavyweights, particularly because in America, the heavyweights were always the ones that set the standard. In other countries, boxing, which remains very big in other countries, in Latin America, it's huge in Britain right now. But in Latin America, smaller weight fighters were national heroes on the same scale as these guys. But in America, there are some lower weight fighters who are very famous in America. Sugar Ray Robinson from the 40s and 50s is a very famous one, and later Sugar Ray Leonard, who borrowed his name. So there have been those great fighters, but Americans, I think it's probably just our national DNA. We are very much connected to the idea of we're a big country. We have big ambitions. People come here with big plans, and the idea of boxing, who is the biggest, who is the best, who's the toughest, and that's always been the heavyweight champion. And then just the history of the division has tended to track these broader social trends most consistently.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there are the 7 champs you really focus on. And I was wondering, was there anybody that you felt particularly bad about having to leave out? Somebody on the margins who you thought, I just don't have room, but this is a great story.
Well, they're all in here. I mean, I wish I could have written more about some of them. I had to cut to the original draft of the book was almost twice this length, so I had a lot of cutting to do. There are a lot of things to say. Some of those guys I mentioned at the end who are not in the Big Seven, people like George Foreman. I mean, his whole second life, again, it's that second acts thing. His whole second life, he completely remakes himself as a businessman and a preacher and a community person. When he was younger, he was not the most benevolent seeming person. I didn't get into crime like Tyson did, but he wasn't exactly Mr. Friendly the way he is now. So there are a lot of figures in here. Gene Tunney I mentioned again. There are guys whose whole life. There's another movie 10 or 12 years ago. Some of you may have seen that movie Cinderella Man. It was starring Russell Crowe. So that's another figure in the book. He's not one of the major 7, but his name was James J Braddock. He's a fairly obscure champion. He was only champion for a little while. But his story was huge in Depression America because he had been on relief. He had little kids. He was being turned out of his house. The lights were being turned off. He was just living the Depression nightmare that so many people were. And then he rallied in the ring to win the heavyweight championship of the world. It became a hero to really the whole country. And then he takes his money and goes back to the relief office and pays back the relief office what he got on welfare. Now, this is a very famous aspect of his story. It's in the movie. Russell Crowe does it. It's a very dramatic scene. But what I didn't know until I read this book is that 2 other guys did the same thing. Joe Louis did it. and another champion named Jersey Joe Walcott, another one of these sort of minor figures. 3 guys had been on relief during Depression, and when they got back in the money, they went down to their local relief office and paid them back. It's quite remarkable. It tells you something about the times, I think.
So one of the things that comes out in the book is that, the 20th century is the American century, and it's heavyweight boxing in the 20th century is American heavyweight boxing, with very few exceptions. And then in the last decade and a half, and you trace this in the book, but it passes really to the UK, primarily now to Ukraine in the figure of 2 brothers.
Yeah.
But why would you say that happened? What happened here that we lost it? Why did heavyweight boxing fade away in America?
I do not know. I do not know the answer. People talk about this all the time in boxing circles, and when I've done interviews for the book, almost everybody asks me that, because American fighters at lower weights remain in boxing today. I mean, Floyd Mayweather was on top for a very long time. He's an American. There are plenty of American fighters, not maybe as many as there were in the golden days of boxing, but there's still plenty of them. Why it's fallen off from the heavyweight division is something that people talk about a lot. One of the theories that never really was very persuasive to me is that they all ran off to play football. I don't quite follow that, but really, people really think that there was better, that playing football was a better bet, it was better money, and there's no better money than being heavyweight champion. Nobody, even now, nobody makes money that the top boxers do. Floyd Mayweather made $200 million for one fight. I mean, it's unbelievable. Jack Dempsey made it close to $1 million for one fight in the 1920s. Babe Ruth's top salary at the time was $52,000. Later got up to $80,000. So they're off the charts. It's not even close to what other athletes make, and that's still the case. So I don't know why they would have suddenly run off to join football. It's really, I don't know the answer.
I think the football-boxing comparison is interesting for a few reasons. One is because Mayweather makes $200 million, but the guys on the undercard make vastly less than that, and the spread in boxing is so much bigger than it is in
other
football or in league sports in general. And part of that is because, for obvious reasons, there's one man in the ring. The contract negotiations are more mercenary, and people are out for themselves.
Yeah.
But the other thing with boxing and football is you've got all this stuff about CTE now in football, which is essentially the repetitive head injury causing brain trauma and leading to Parkinson's and other long-term effects. But I guess for a while, people probably assumed football was the safer option. It's not clear that's true anymore.
No, it's certainly not. And football is definitely in the crosshairs now with the head injuries. It's interesting in all the talk about football head injuries, you hardly ever hear boxing mentioned. And I think that's because people just kind of written it off, like, well, obviously they get it, because boxing has always had that kind of reputation. Even way back in the 20s, they were doing brain studies of fighters, and so I mean, you look at old movies, and there's punch-drunk fighters who are characters. So it's with boxing, it's not news at all. It's always the kind of thing that shadowed the sport, and I guess people have just kind of factored it in. I mean, there are a lot of people who think boxing obviously should be abolished. I mean, that was a big movement, at different times during the history. And I think it's become so marginal now that the abolitionists just they don't really care about it. But football is clearly the one that's getting the attention now.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about boxing too is you're saying people kind of written it off. I think that's partly because people assume that the guys who go into boxing, and it's mostly men, though there is women's boxing as well, and there have been some great champs, but people assume that the people who go into boxing are sort of marginal and cast-offs anyway. And the latter half of the 20th century, I think that was sort of the idea, and so it's almost like less precious cargo getting damaged.
I mean, that's a brutal way of saying it, but I think it's true. I mean, it's kind of the way it's always drawn from the lowest rungs. Boxing is always drawn from the lowest rungs more than any other sport. It's always been the sport for the ascendant social group. So that's, when John L Sullivan was in there for the Irish were actually the first great class of fighters. All the fighters were Irish, and then Jewish fighters came along, and they were great for a while. And to market themselves better, a lot of them would change their names so they sounded Irish. So that would happen quite a bit. And then, Italian fighters got in there for a while, Rocky Marciano, but also some lower weight fighters. And obviously black fighters have been present all along, and they have been, the lower weights, they were usually permitted some opportunity, but at the heavyweight level, they were kind of shut out after Jack Johnson, and then Joe Louis changed that. After that, blacks got their opportunity. But it really has. I mean, going right through. Mike Tyson, desperately poor. Evander Holyfield was quite poor. George Foreman grew up very poor. Muhammad Ali is actually one of the more unusual ones. He grew up in a comparatively middle-class circumstances. He had a very nice family and a very intact family, the Clay family in Louisville. So he's kind of atypical. Most of these other guys come from really grinding poverty, much more so than a college football player or even a college basketball player.
Yeah, and those are the guys who reached the heights, but for every one of them, there's
countless others
who,
with head damage,
right, come from
no money.
positions as destitute and have little more than head damage to show for it, which is maybe why there's an image that boxing produced, a kind of character you associate with boxing, the palooka, that has a kind of tragic mythos around them that you don't get in other sports. So palooka, if people aren't familiar with the term, is basically a boxer who was never going to amount to anything, or maybe came close but never did amount to anything, and they're just kind of punch drunk and wandering around. Now it's is that a fair description? I find a tough word to describe now, but
it's as I said, it's a prominent image in movies, especially old movies like Requiem for a Heavyweight, or a whole bunch of boxing movies. It's interesting, as boxing fell off in prominence, the boxing movie has never lost its appeal. Boxing movies, they're out almost every year. There's another boxing movie, and people flock to them, even people who don't watch boxing anymore. I think it's because you were getting at some of this. Just the sport itself is so elemental. It's just natural for a movie, because you've got two guys, and you can create a plot around that pretty easily. So it retains that dramatic structure. But speaking of the punch-drunk fighter, I mean, I think that's another fascinating aspect of Muhammad Ali's career. Of course, his career ends up with him with this terrible illness, which he was the one fighter who, when he came along, was such an incredible communicator, such an incredible talker. He was the guy who was going to avoid this. He was the guy who was going to do it differently. He was the guy who was going to get out with his money and his brains, and it didn't happen. And so it lends a kind of a really dark undercurrent to his story, because he, like so many fighters before him, he just couldn't walk away when he should have, whether it was for money or for ego or whatever it was. I think it was a combination of both those things. Some people said it was just the money. I don't think it was just the money. I think it was hard to be Muhammad Ali anywhere else but the boxing ring. Once you've been that, how do you walk around and go to the grocery store? It's just not going to give you the same. So I think he loved the crowd. I think he loved the adulation, and he also needed the money. All those things went together, and he just stayed far too long and took far too many punches.
yeah.
So, in fact, there's a new book on Muhammad Ali, brand new biography, big new biography by a guy named Jonathan Eig that's getting a lot of attention. And he actually worked with these punch stat computation guys to go through all the available films of Ali and count the number of punches he took through his whole career, and then to kind of estimate all the punches through training and gyms, and to come up to an estimate. And the estimate they came to was 200,000 punches that he took. If you had a kid or something, someone came home and said, I was hit 200,000 times, it'd be a wonder they'd be alive, let alone walking around. You look at his condition in that light, and it's no wonder, that it happened.
Yeah. So the other thing we were talking about before is, you mentioned Mayweather-McGregor, which might have been a circus, but was a very entertaining circus that, I went to a bar to watch. And other than that, this has been actually a really great year for boxing. And last year was pretty good too. So Canelo Golovkin just happened. I don't know if anybody saw that, but the two finally the two
fighters.
top fighters fought each other, which is precisely what had not been happening in boxing for many years. Now we've got two top middleweight fighters, which is one of the most competitive weight classes.
Yeah.
Kovalev, Andre Ward had two fantastic fights. With controversy didn't hurt those two fights. Speaking of Andre Ward, if people haven't heard of him, might be the best boxer pound for pound of this generation. He's never lost a fight. He's been fighting since he was 11 years old. Was an Olympian, never lost a fight as an amateur or as a pro, and just retired. God willing, he'll stay retired because that's a guy who went out at the right time.
And he's made lots of money, and in fact,
Yeah.
in retiring, he mentioned the damage. He
Yeah.
mentioned his desire.
He's a light heavyweight now. He started off as a middleweight. He couldn't get the fight with Golovkin because Golovkin didn't want to go up, and he didn't want to get boiled down. So he went up to light heavy, took a few tune-up fights, and then fought Kovalev, who was this killer at light heavyweight, and beat him twice. But so Ward, Kovalev, Golovkin, Canelo, now Rigondeaux and Lomachenko are going to fight. So it's starting to come back. Does boxing still have a real place in American culture, do you think, or is this just sort of the exception now?
I mean, it's hard to. It seems to me like a niche thing. It seems to me. I mean, I tune in from time to time because I grew up watching it. I don't follow it the same way that I did, and probably not because some missing element is no longer there that seemed to connect to these bigger things. I could enjoy a good fight, go to a bar, that would be fun, but I don't follow it. And I think a lot of people in my shoes people who have talked to me about the book, they will all say, hey, whatever happened to all of this? And that's kind of, I remember that. They say, I remember boxing, I remember watching boxing. And so one thing we were talking about is it left regular television. When I grew up, as a kid, it was on regular TV, and now it's almost always on pay-per-view or cable, and that's just a good way to destroy your sport. I mean, it's very lucrative for the fighters, but you kind of isolate yourself from the main currents of things. If people still watch baseball and football on regular TV, they still just want to have it there, and boxing makes it hard. It makes it hard to find, and expensive to find. So I think that's a big part of it, but. The answer to me, I mean, it would be self-serving, but I think it's the heavyweights again. If an American came along who was going to try to fight for this title again, and he was a compelling figure, then I think we would find out whether any of this kind of stuff could happen again. I'm kind of skeptical that it could because I think we just live in a different time. There's so many sports now. There's so many choices. There's another thing about this story is a whole different culture. It's pre-internet and most of it is pre-cable TV, and the world was just much more. There's just far fewer choices, and so I don't really know if anyone can kind of stand astride the culture the way that these guys once did. But it would be interesting to see some American try it.
Seems to me that the closest you get these days to that kind of throwback to more of not a monoculture, but a time when everybody was watching the same thing and a champ really represented more than just themselves. They kind of intersected with the larger national narrative. The closest you get to that today is not in boxing, it's in MMA, and it's a guy like Conor McGregor who's become this sort of avatar for...
Jake, what's MMA?
MMA is mixed martial arts, so it's what you think of as the UFC. And Conor McGregor is this Irish champion who won 2 different belts in the UFC. He won as a featherweight, then as a lightweight, and then he held both of those belts simultaneously, and then he jumped over to boxing to fight Floyd Mayweather, a fight he had no business taking. Mayweather
Made $100 million.
He made 100. He had no business taking except as a businessman. But was, I think, a more entertaining fight than people thought. It was sure as hell better than Mayweather-Pacquiao, which people spent $100 on pay-per-view for and left disappointed. But a guy like him, or more recently in the UFC, there were 2 light heavyweights, Daniel Cormier and John Jones, and they had a really great rivalry. And maybe it's passing to this new sport, or maybe this new sport will re-energize boxing.
Could be. I mean, MMA, as we call it, I guess is the best way to describe it now, is definitely taught boxing a couple of lessons. I mean, it was certainly marketed much more smartly than boxing, and it went on regular TV. It is much better organized. It gives fans what they want. It gives them fights that they want to see. So, you know, and it seems to attract the younger demographic too. Younger males seem to like MMA a lot more than boxing. I'm kind of traditional. I've watched a little of it. It doesn't do a lot for me. I certainly respect the fighters, but. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, team sports themselves are contested in some ways. They're having trouble. I mean, football is embroiled in all kinds of things, controversies with the head and the politics and everything else. So it's an interesting time. I don't know if any figure can even Michael Jordan, who I mentioned earlier. I mean, that was the NBA, and I'm not sure anybody's even really matched that level of fame since he left either. So it's sometimes I just think the dispersal of the media and everything. It's hard to have that same person kind of rise up as high as they did in this earlier time.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question, then we'll turn it over. It's if the era has passed, and if these champs you're describing, their place in the culture has passed and is unrecoverable because it belongs to the past, what have we lost? What was in that moment? What was in that that place that boxing had that we've lost now?
I think a connection between athletes and people's experiences, and you know, it's these guys coming from groups that people immediately related to them. It's not that obviously athletes, everybody comes from somewhere, so you can still relate to them. But you know, the money today in sports has isolated athletes from people so much. And you think about the old days when Rocky Marciano in the 1950s. This was an era when baseball and football players, most of them still worked in the winter time. They had winter jobs because they didn't make very much money. They'd, work for Sears or something like that, and then they'd go back and play in spring training. And I think that the fighters were very much like this too. They were connected to their neighborhoods in some ways. They were connected to their communities. Rocky Marciano was very tight with his hometown. Joe Louis fought out of Detroit. He was very connected with Detroit. He had businesses there. And I think a lot of that is lost now in this kind of globalism that we have, and people don't even know where they're from anymore, and there's that sense that that everybody's kind of an independent actor. And so I think that's one of the important things that's been lost, is that for whatever reason, these guys, when they came along, their successes seem to tell us something about ourselves, and I'm not sure athletes really do that today, at least,
Yeah. I think the other thing, just quickly, and then we'll open it up, is, it's hard to have that connection between athlete and individual in boxing when there's 40 different belts and you don't know
who's the champion,
the champ, and all these different promotions. So boxing has done a lot, in my opinion, to shoot itself in the foot, and ironically, some of that has to do with fighters being more empowered compared to the UFC, for instance, where it's more hierarchical. But because it's more hierarchical, can kind of force fights that satisfy the fans more, even if they're not in the fighter's interest.
Right.
So that's great. Thanks, Paul. And sort of fascinating how many of these guys went into theater, actually, speaking of that. But.
Yeah, that was a huge thing. John L Sullivan went in vaudeville. They would go on theater tours. Again, it's a different culture. If you wanted to be entertained, you had to leave your house. You couldn't put it on the phone or the cable TV. And so these guys, whenever they would make personal appearances, baseball players did it too. They'd go on vaudeville, they'd go in theater. Jack Dempsey did Broadway plays, he did movies.
Right.
Just these ridiculous movies. Most of them have been lost, unfortunately, but there's a little clip of him with Charlie Chaplin. So they were always doing something outside of the ring. And there's another thing with this title. Once you had this title, it was just like a passport to just go and basically do whatever you wanted and make more money without getting punched, which is nice. Yes.
Yes. Did Mike Tyson get penalized for the infamous ear-biting incident?
He did get penalized. He had his boxing license suspended in Nevada, where the fight took place.
Whose ear did he bite?
Holyfield.
Evander Holyfield. I don't know if you've seen the commercial where he hands the ear back to Evander Holyfield, but it's a memorable, shall we say. But yes, he was penalized for a while, but then boxing, there's always somewhere else that you can find to fight. So yeah.
Good. Good.
In the back.
After you, please. Okay. And first of all, thank you, gentlemen, for coming here. I'm a huge fan of boxing since I was a kid, and I'm glad that the young people here are learning about this. Getting back to what you had mentioned earlier about the theory, when you asked a question earlier, about why the heavyweight division, especially in America, has kind of gone down. I think actually there has been a little bit of effect, and I want you to comment on this, in terms of like basketball and football, that I think that what's happening right now, I think one of the reasons why you still see a lot of talented American fighters. In the lower weight classes, they're not big enough to play football and basketball. But I think that a whole bunch of factors, like again, the NBA has gotten so huge.
Yeah.
Since the 1980s, like a lot of the young people here will not remember that it used to be the NBA playoffs. You would actually have those taped late 11:30 at night.
Yes.
NBA final. I mean, seriously. Until Bird,
Jordan, yeah, that's
Johnson came along, and I just think, and also maybe even just the lack of even just like how you'll even hear stories about why there are so many fewer African American baseball players, lack of baseball diamonds in inner city. Lack of boxing gyms in the city. Like this gentleman mentioned about how boxing was so ubiquitous in the 50s, it being the #1 sport on television, it translated well on television, and there were cards all over New York, all across the country, in gyms all across the country. I'm from Pittsburgh, same thing. Do you think maybe that might even be a bit of a factor why?
Definitely. I mean, there's a lot of things to say. I mean, boxing, its real peak would be like from the 30s to the 50s. And when television came in, television was great for boxing initially because it was the first sport on TV. It's perfect for boxing because it fits right inside a box. And it was on all the time. It was on Friday nights. There was Wednesday night fights. I think there were the Thursday night fights. And they were on all the time. But the problem is it started to make people not go out to the fights because they said, go watch it at home. And for some reason, this hurt boxing more than it hurt other sports because, I mean, people started watching baseball on TV, but it didn't seem to make them not want to go out to the ballpark. But they started going to these clubs less. The clubs started closing down, fewer gyms. All of that is totally true. There's far fewer gyms. But again, to me, but why would that hit the heavyweights so hard and not the other divisions? That's the part I can't figure out.
I think some of them are like maybe because of that they're being more led to other sports, whereas the guys who are like maybe the 150.
Oh, I see what you're saying, because they couldn't play basketball or something.
Or like
right?
saying
They're too small.
we can only stay in boxing because we're not big enough to play football, big enough to play basketball, whereas these guys who are like over 200 pounds, because I mean, there were such great athletes in the 70s, pure athletes like Ali, Kenny Norton, Foreman, all these guys. I'm even wondering if they grow up today, they might have like moved more towards those other sports.
Well, and the heavyweights who are around today are huge. They're way bigger than these guys. 6'6" and 260.
Or maybe
Klitschko was 6'7".
Gigantic guys. So
not nearly as strict as it is in the UFC, for instance. So
that's what I would guess.
because the UFC has unified testing, supervised by WADA, I believe, which is who does the Olympic testing. You know, it's uniform, and it's uniform across the country also. So with boxing, it's state to state and fight to fight, which is why, if you recall, one of the early hang-ups with the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight was that Mayweather wanted Pacquiao to be subjected to Olympic testing for very good reason, because Pacquiao, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble who's a Pacquiao fan, but was obviously juicing for much of his career, which is, there's a controversial
highly
statement.
contentious. So.
To me, was obviously juicing, which is how he jumped up so many weight classes and stayed so competitive. But certainly there was reason to think he was juicing. I think PEDs, in the absence of a really strict, aggressive testing protocol, you can assume that in every major sport where there are big paydays, PEDs are very, very widespread. Wherever they are not being aggressively ferreted out, there's just too much money and they're there. Let me suggest one more American. Anthony Joshua is a great fighter. He's exciting. Anything is better than the Klitschko era, in my opinion. But you should look into Danny Jacobs, who's from Brooklyn, who gave Golovkin a great fight. Lost, but he gave him Golovkin his biggest challenge before Canelo. Battled cancer, survived cancer to come back and still be a contender. Danny Jacobs is an impressive guy out of the ring and a really good boxer.
He's fighting at Nassau Coliseum in a couple months.
Fighting in Nassau in a couple, and he's from Brooklyn, so I would check him out.
Yes, James J. Corbett is another guy. He's not in the 7, but the James J. Corbett is going way back. He's the guy who beats John L. Sullivan. It's the first guy mentioned. James J. Corbett is this guy, they call him Gentleman Jim. He likes fancy clothes. He goes into the theater. He ends up, after being heavyweight champion, having a career in the theater for the rest of his life, 35, 40 years. He forms an early actors union in Broadway. He has a restaurant down in Broadway. His whole career, the rest of his career, was a theater, silent films, all this. I didn't realize the extent of this until I was working on the book. So he was very successful actually outside of the ring. Again, another one of these guys who took that title and made it work in all these other ways. So he's a pretty interesting guy. Great question. I love that story. It's a very famous story about Jack Dempsey, who after his boxing career, he ran a famous restaurant on Broadway in Manhattan called Jack Dempsey's. And if you watch the first Godfather movie, when Michael Corleone is going to go and make that big hit on the cop and the other guy, they go and pick him up in front of Dempsey's, and they show the big marquee. And it was a Manhattan mainstay for about 40 years. But there was a famous story that somewhere around maybe the late 60s or so, when Dempsey would have been in his early 70s, that he was jumped by 2 muggers, and he hit one with the right and one with the left and put them both on the sidewalk until the cops came. The only problem with the story is I've looked and looked and looked through newspaper archives to find it, and I haven't found it. What I found is years later people writing about it and talking about it, but I've never found the actual story, which doesn't mean it didn't happen. I don't know. I'd love to believe it's true. I hope it's true. About Jack Johnson. Yeah, I think so. I mean, that was a play that came out in the late 60s, and it starred James Earl Jones, and he played Jack Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, and I think they made it into a movie also. I think they pretty accurately, actually, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but I think the public opinion, the racism directed toward him is pretty accurately described. I think they do smooth out some of the edges about Jack Johnson, though. He was a little more of a high-flying character than they portray him in the movie. He's a little bit more reckless than they portray him in the movie. But I think they got the racism accurately. Well, it would have changed a lot because Frazier, as you said, would have had a 2-1 lead, but it wouldn't have happened, in my view, because even if Ali really was going to quit, as he later said, his trainer, Angelo Dundee, would have pushed him out there because he'd done that before, and I know he would have done it in this case. The fight he's talking about, in case people don't know, this is one of the most famous fights in the history of boxing. It's the 3rd fight between Muhammad Ali and his greatest rival, Joe Frazier. It's called the Thrilla in Manila. It took place in Manila in the Philippines. It's one of the most savage fights that you could ever watch. This guy I mentioned earlier who wrote the biography of Ali, who counted up all the punches, counted that Ali took 440 punches from Frazier in that fight. And having Joe Frazier hit you 440 times is not like having, it's not just anybody punching you. So it was a really brutal fight. It was about 100 degrees in the Coliseum. It was just this really gladiatorial kind of thing. It gets to the end of there's 1 round left. Back then they fought 15 rounds. And Frazier's eyes have closed down. He can't see anything. And his trainer decided he was not going to let him come out. So he said, you're done. And the story that has always circulated since then is that Ali was about to quit himself. So in other words, instead of winning the fight, Ali might have lost if people had waited maybe 10 more seconds to quit. I'm not sure I've ever really bought that story. I think Ali may have wanted to quit, but again, as I say, he had a trainer, a guy named Angelo Dundee, who I think just would have pushed him out there. Ali had taken control of the fight, and I think he would have just pushed him out to get through one more round.
Throwing in the towel in boxing is it's a good thing, and it's not passed on. It's one of the things that unfortunately hasn't passed on to some of the other fighting sports, where it's considered unmanly, as it was in boxing as well to some extent. But the standing 8 count is tied very directly to the brain trauma in boxing, because if you get a flash knockout, it's actually standing 8 count in boxing is if you get sort of wobbled on your feet, they'll stop you. So you didn't get knocked to the ground, but your legs go out and you're sort of jelly. They'll stop you and they'll count to 8, and then you can keep fighting. Well, that's actually much worse than getting knocked out, because then you get this repetitive trauma. So that's one of the better things in boxing in terms of protecting fighters.
Yeah, and I should say, just I'm going to go to him, but on that fight, I also want to go on the record. The trainer of Frazier was a guy named Eddie Futch, whose name should be better remembered. This is one of the great acts, in my opinion, of humanity in boxing that he did. He was a terrific human being. He was also a brilliant trainer. And he actually thought in his head at the time that his guy was winning the fight, which he wasn't, but he thought he was winning. He didn't care if he was winning. He was going to protect him. He'd had enough. His eyes were closing. He was afraid he was going to go blind. And he stopped the fight. Not every trainer would have done that. And I think, so I think it was a really noble gesture on his part to stop that fight. Yeah, my personal experience with boxing is I have older brothers. So we all kind of got into it together. We grew up in the late 70s, and boxing was on TV a lot, and it came from a sporting household. My father was a pretty good high school baseball player. In fact, he had some pro tryouts. He loved all the major sports, but he wasn't a big boxing guy. He would have to be on once in a while, but somehow we just became captured by it. I think I love the individual nature of it, and I was just very drawn to it. So we bought up all the equipment and the Sears boxing gloves and the speed bags and the punching bag gloves, which are different, and we found a tackling dummy from the high school football team, and we strung that up, and that was our heavy bag. And we boxed together for many years. I never formalized it. I never went down to a gym or tried to do it. One part of me wishes I had, and the other part of me thinks it was one of the rare moments of youthful self-knowledge that I didn't. But one of my brothers I went to the same college with, so we kept doing it through college. And then at my senior year in college, I got hit with a punch that made my jaw kind of feel like it was like flapping around for about 2 days. And I thought, what if it never gets back to, what if it stays like this forever? I thought maybe this is the end. Maybe I need to get a job and go on and live a normal life. So that was the end of it for me. But we did it for many years together. Yeah, you mean in the book? I mean, these guys? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Most of them, the managers and trainers played a pretty important role. I mentioned Angelo Dundee, who was Muhammad Ali's trainer. Now, in some senses, Angelo Dundee, you could say that any trainer might have made it with Muhammad Ali, because Muhammad Ali is very unique. He had a very good trainer, but he also was completely self-willed. So he would disregard the advice he got from his trainer. He would only do what he felt like doing. And so he's kind of unusual in that respect. One of his most famous fights, and people remember when he fought George Foreman in his famous fight called the rope-a-dope, when he leans on the ropes and let Foreman hit him until Foreman got tired. His corner was going crazy between the rounds because they thought he was going to get himself knocked out, and he just said, "Shut up, I know what I'm doing." And it was all his idea. So he's kind of atypical. Most of the other guys in the book, they would follow their trainer's advice and follow the manager's advice pretty much to the letter. But there are some very colorful managers in here, very successful at moving their guy forward. But as you suggested with the corruption angle, the best boxing managers often have their hands in a lot of different areas, because this is not a clean and pristine universe to operate in. Yeah.
This has troubled me for years. When Burgess Meredith did something to Sylvester Stallone's eyes in Rocky, was that real life or was that Hollywood hype?
I don't know. What's the scene?
He cuts the...
Oh, no, if it's what I'm thinking of, that's a technique
cuts the eye open
to
when it's
relieve
bulged
swelling. You see, they have, I forget what it's called,
If you're caught, you
End-swell.
end swell. The end
End-swell,
swell
yeah.
is, it's like ions or something. I've never
Yeah.
quite understood
I
it.
wasn't familiar.
You're probably
Say
better
yes.
off on this. I mean,
All of the
that
above.
decision itself, the boxing is famous for terrible decisions, but I have to say on the outrage meter, that one didn't score that high for me. I mean, I did watch it on tape a week later, and I did think it was the wrong decision. I did think that Golovkin won, but I didn't think it was such an incredible robbery. I've seen fights where one guy seems to have won all 12 rounds, and then they announce the decision and they give it to the other guy, and it's just everyone just can't believe it, So I thought that was actually a pretty good fight, but it was a bad decision. But how far the corruption runs today, I think I would hand that to Jake. I mean, boxing has been corrupt from the time it began, and I don't want to sound cynical or despairing about it, but I mean, efforts have been made over many years to try to clean it up. There's this famous law, the Muhammad Ali Act, that Senator John McCain got behind. It seems very difficult to roll it all up and pull it under unified control. There's so many pieces of it. I don't know what the answer is.
Part of it is, better judges with making judges accountable. So the problem with the Golovkin-Canelo card, which I agree was closer than a lot of people made it. I don't think Golovkin ran away with it or anything, but it was that the one judge, Adelaide Bird, had it 18 to 10,
yeah.
which was absurd. And the problem historically has been that nothing will happen. You know, there will be some attention that'll pass. I think there's a lot of corruption in boxing. Is the short answer.
Yeah.
Why don't we have Monaco and then Robert?
And
then
she
us.
had a question too.
One small
Yes.
question.
Yes.
Yeah. What's your take on another infamous fight, the Roberto Duran and no mas, no mas?
Yeah, that's not in the book. Yeah, that's a very famous fight. Well, I have a pretty traditional take on that. I think that Roberto Duran, this is a fight where Roberto Duran was facing Sugar Ray Leonard. Many of you have probably heard the name Sugar Ray Leonard. It was 1980, so it was a long time ago. I can't believe I can actually remember it, but I can. In fact, I lost a bet in school about it. But Roberto Duran was fighting Sugar Ray Leonard, and in the 8th round, he just quit. He threw up his hands and walked away and said, supposedly, no mas, meaning no more. And people have wondered ever since what happened. Duran's official story has always been, I had terrible stomach cramps. I had to quit fighting. It's a little hard to believe this guy was one of the toughest fighters that ever stepped into a ring. A lot of people's interpretation, I would go with it, is that Sugar Ray Leonard had started taunting Roberto Duran. He had started humiliating him, and he had started frustrating him. And Roberto Duran had never faced that before in the ring. He was a man of incredible pride, and he was all used to having his way in the ring.
Right.
And I think what happened is he had a very temporary, fast sort of mental breakdown
He
that
psyched him.
within about 60 seconds he realized what he had done and said, oh my God, what have I done? But I think he just had a meltdown in the ring and said, the heck with this, I don't want to do this anymore. Stop it,
I agree
you know?
with that.
And then, you know, he, by the time he got to his dressing room, he realized that this terrible thing he'd done, which hung over his career for the rest of his life. But some people insist that he really was sick and that he did have stomach distress. I mean, you know, we'll probably never know the answer. No, I can't say Don King was good for the sport.
Really?
No, I mean, I would just cite all the lawsuits from fighters who have dragged him into court for claims of being shortchanged in money and for all the other claims made against him. He has demoralized many honest and brave fighters, and I think his influence is very regrettable of it. I have to admit, though, he is a very colorful figure, and he's a very American figure, completely self-made, out of nowhere, spikes up the hair, all of a sudden, you're a power player. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Very shrewd man, very smart man, actually. I don't even know what the total profitability of the two sports. I don't even know if anybody measures that. Boxing is so dispersed, but my hunch is MMA has reached its kind of peak or plateau. But you probably differ with me. But I'm not sure it's going to get much bigger than it. I think it's kind of reached its top. But it's just an opinion.